my pleasure to welcome you to our talks on a world in crisis, which we are organizing as the Department of International Relations at Özyeğin University. This evening, we'll be having a talk and a discussion on the book, Capitalism Alone, the future of the system that rules the world by renowned economist Branko Milanovic. We'll be looking at inequality, in a system in which, as Milanovic argues, capitalism is the only game in town. Can I introduce you, please, Professor Milanovic, just very briefly? I mean, everybody knows you very well, and our discussant as well. One second. Branko Milanovic is a very accomplished scholar, and he has a very long list of accomplishments. I can't do justice in my introduction, but I'll be very brief and try to introduce him to you. He's a presidential professor at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and a senior fellow at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. Professor Milanovic holds a PhD in economics from the University of Belgrade, and he served as a lead economist in the World Bank's research department for 2 decades. Then he left there to write his book on global income inequality, published in 2005, called Worlds Apart. He was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and has held teaching appointments at the University of Maryland and at the Paul Neate School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He was a visiting scholar at All Souls College in Oxford and Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. His main area of work is income inequality in individual countries and globally, including in pre-industrial societies. His book, The Haves and the Have-Nots, was selected by The Globalist as the 2011 Book of the Year. Global Inequality was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the best political book of 2016, and the Hans Matthöfer Prize in 2018, and was translated into 16 languages. In 2018, Milanovic was awarded or was the co-recipient of the Leontiev Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Knowledge. His latest book is Capitalism Alone, which we'll be talking about today. Our discussant, Professor Hasan Tekgüç, is a professor of economics at Kadir Has University. He has his bachelor degrees from Boğaziçi University and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2010. His main fields of interest are development and labor economics. His studies in the development field are focused on the calculation of alternative poverty measures and the impact evaluation of social assistance on poverty and inequality. In the field of labor economics, his research is focused on the gender wage gap, job transition, minimum wage, and the impact of Syrian migrants on natives' employment in Turkey. He has lots of publications. I'm not going to list them all here, but in prominent journals. And currently, he's the principal investigator of a research project from the Turkish, from the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. So, as we discussed before, Professor Milanovic will be talking for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then Professor Tekgüç will be responding for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then Professor Milanovic will respond to the discussion points, and then we'll go into Q&A session. So the floor is yours, Professor Milanovic.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure. I have to say that my association with Turkey goes a long time, because my first work in the World Bank was in Turkey. For many young people, they might not even remember those days, but this was a long time ago. Actually, I spent quite a lot of time in Turkey and made lots of friends, and actually including some of whom I've really stayed in touch for all this time. So as you have very kindly summarized, My most recent book that we are going to discuss today is called Capitalism Alone. I would actually, as you can see here, I would focus on some of the issues on which I call Homoploutia, but I will come to that in a minute when I explain what it is. Let me try to get, let me just say a few words about the structure of the book, because I would obviously not have the time to present all parts of it. In the book, by the way, is translated into Turkish as well, so just to mention that. In the first chapter, which is short, I actually argue that there are two really big changes in the post-Cold War world. And the first one is that capitalism is the sole mode of production around the world, which of course we will discuss further during the talk. And which means that basically China is capitalist. So that's, of course, a big issue that some people don't agree with. And the second big change is the rise of Asia. So that rise of Asia now is, of course, accepted by everybody because of geopolitical sort of a conflict between the United States and China. But it is broader than that. The rise of Asia, which is, of course, not only China, but it's also India, Vietnam, Indonesia, is really bringing the relative level of economic activity in the Eurasian continent to where it was in around 1500. In other words, we have had a period of the two last centuries where the Western countries after the industrialization became much richer. And obviously India and China stayed at the same level of income. In the medicines data, moreover, actually China shows a decline. But that is an anomaly, historical anomaly, because the differences between East Asia and Europe were really rather small or non-existent, or were even in favor of Asia or China, for example, before maybe 1200 or 1300. So that's actually a big change, that actually we are going back to the same, more or less, same level of economic activity in the whole of the Eurasian continent that existed before. And then the next two chapters deal with the two sort of exemplars of the capitalism, because as I argue, capitalism, while it has won around the world, has not won in exactly the same form. So the first one in chapter 2 is liberal meritocratic capitalism, of which I will speak today. So I will not say more about that. And the second one, which is basically the Chinese to some extent, but of course Vietnamese, Angolan, Algerian, and other political capitalism. And I have to say a few words there, because the first part of that chapter really looks at the genesis of political capitalism. My argument was that the political capitalism was essentially a system that was created by the left-wing or communist resistance to capitalism, to colonialism in nations that were either colonized or semi-colonized, and whose the objective, of course, is of left-wing or communist parties, was to first get countries independent, and secondly, break all the feudal institutions that were anti-growth, or actually they were sort of making growth impossible, or modern economic growth impossible. So these two objectives, political independence and economic development, were something which were, in my opinion, defining the communist movements in the colonized countries. And I actually see the main turning point in the 1920s with the Comintern decision to include actually anti-imperialist struggle into the left-wing struggle. So out of that then developed, not by design, but by accidents of history, developed indigenous capitalism of China. So the political capitalism is to some extent an inheritance of that anti-colonial struggle. So that was the sort of the genesis that I actually discuss in chapter 3 on political capitalism. And I think that part is quite important, because I'm not just taking China and the US as it's very fashionable nowadays and sticking them together. I think what is really important in case of China and Vietnam is to see that historical background. Then the chapter 4 is the interaction of capitalism and globalization. There are several aspects there. I will not talk about that today. The first is about movement of capital and global value chains. The second is about movement of labor and immigration. The third one is the role of the welfare state in a globalized world. And the fourth one, which is, I think, an interesting topic, is about the pervasiveness of corruption in the world. In other words, the links between globalization and corruption. And finally, in chapter 5, I will talk about the future of global capitalism, and I discuss the issues such as increased commodification of many things, including in our private life and leisure activities and so on. So that's the structure. So now I would like to focus only on chapter 2, but I would be very happy from the little that I've said, maybe, and maybe some people have read the book, to discuss also chapter 3 and the role of China and that explanation of what, in my view of the world, was the role of global historical role of communism, which is a little bit, I have to say, ironic for people who are like myself influenced by Marxism, because it basically puts communism or Communist Party in a position of enablers of the development of endogenous, autochthonous, domestic capitalisms. So it's a reversal of the sort of a normal sort of roles that we assign to communist revolutions. So to go over liberal or meritocratic capitalism, I have first to say that the terms are not chosen randomly. They come from John Rawls's definitions of liberal or meritocratic, or rather meritocratic and liberal equality. Now, meritocratic equality is really not saying much. It's just saying that there is no impediments to people achieving given positions in society, legal impediments. So you don't have a system of like, between nobility and plebs, which doesn't allow, people from ordinary conditions to become somebody. You don't have a system like in the Roman Empire that actually only senators could get certain jobs. You don't have the system where the clergy only could get certain positions. So it's simply legal equality or equality before the law. So that was the term of meritocratic. So it's not like what many people believe in the sense that it is something that is that you deserve and you get that. It is simply technical term that there are no legal impediments. The second term, liberal, again comes from John Rawls, and that means in John Rawls that there are two correctives in terms of ability of ordinary people to reach actually high position in society. There's two correctives are taxation of inheritance, which actually should then equalize chances of individuals regardless whether they're born to rich or poor parents. And the second one is public education, whose function is the same. So very simply, a liberal capitalism would be the capitalism where we have an attempt to make intergenerational equality between people greater than it would have been without any correctives through education, public education, and inheritance taxation. So that's where the terms come from. Now, in a classical capitalism of the Ricardo Marx type, very simply, we have essentially two groups of people, capitalists and workers. But we have a very special, I think, implicitly distribution of them. Because not only are capitalists richer than workers, this simple graph tries to explain that, where I put income on the horizontal axis and number of people on the vertical axis, but all capitalists are in principle richer than all workers. In other words, you can imagine an extra or extremely segmented capitalist system where really everybody who is a capitalist is richer than a worker, just for simplicity. I know that actually in the 19th century England, it was not exactly like that, but it was close to it, that basically your source of income, meaning property, income from property or from capital, defines your position in income distribution. And this is the most important thing to sort of retain from this idea. It is the source of income that you receive that actually places you in the interpersonal income distribution. And this is not something that we see in the modern capitalism. And this is something that I would actually argue in the rest of the talk. What we see in modern capitalism is broadly speaking, the following distribution. Here are people ranked by total income, and the red line is labor income and the blue line is capital income. So what you see is that, of course, people, as we go towards higher income groups, they have more labor income. Simply, the people are better off if they have higher wages. But what is also interesting when you look at capital income is that 30 to 40% of people in developed capitalist economies, like the United States, have no capital income. So they basically are people with net zero wealth. After that, they start having a little bit of capital income. And as you can see, this line, blue line, starts going up. But it's only when you come to the top 5% of the population, or some cases maybe up to 10%, that you have substantial amounts of capital income there. And at the very top of that income distribution, you have people who have both high capital incomes and high labor incomes. And I would spend quite some time on that. Now, you notice there a very significant difference with classical capitalism. In a classical capitalism, if you were at the top, you did not have labor income because you were sufficiently rich from property that you are not going to go and become a worker and earn labor income if you already have, some huge amount of capital income. But that's no longer the case. And I think it's one of the major changes between the current or modern capitalism and the classical capitalism. As I will argue at the end of the talk, it has some positive sides that you can already see in the sense that that very sharp distinction, class distinction, is now much weaker. But on the other hand, it does create a certain elite that I would argue is very self-sustainable and able to, or trying to transmit those advantages to their offspring. So let me then go to, I know that I will try to speed up things a little bit. I will go through 6 systemic inequalities in liberal and meritocratic capitalism. Some of them I will go very quickly because they're quite well known. I'm not going to read the slide. Of course, you can read the slide yourselves. And also, I would also mention each individual issue as we come. The first one, which I think is very important, is to realize that in most countries today, developed countries today, you have an increase, there is an increase in the capital share. That essentially means that out of the net income or GDP or net national product, if you will, the share of capital is increasing. If you look here at the data for G7 economies, you notice that up to 1980, that share was relatively fixed. It was about 32 and 35% of total value added. After that point, there was a significant increase in the capital share. So this is something which is true at the macro level. Now, what is the reason behind that? And it's not something that I am contributing. This is simply I'm taking from other people's work there. There are many possibilities and people have discussed that. One is globalization and increased competition with labor for labor in the rich countries coming from labor in poor countries. Another is globalization through the large imports of cheaper goods that replace also domestic labor. The third possibility is the weakening trade unions. So the relative power of labor has diminished. The fourth possibility is technological change, which replaces the routine labor and then also reduces the overall share of labor. So essentially, whatever it is, maybe all 4 or maybe more reasons, the share of labor in total has declined. Why is this important? And actually, that's a crucial part. It is important because the reduction in the share of labor translates almost automatically into higher interpersonal inequality because capital income is much more concentrated and it's concentrated at the top than labor income. So you see here in this graph, the blue line is the Gini coefficient of capital income, and the labor line is the Gini coefficient of, and the red line is the Gini coefficient of labor income. Now, in all countries that I know of, you have concentration of capital which exceeds concentration of labor. And as you can see here, there were changes, but the basic story is that the Gini of capital income is about 0.9, very, very high concentration of capital income. So when the capital share goes up, that means that the more unequal source of income becomes more dominant. When the more unequal source of income becomes dominant, you have an increase in interpersonal inequality. So this is, I think, the key point. It was already pointed out by Piketty in Capital in the 21st century. But there was not maybe that much emphasis on this quasi-automatic transmission into interpersonal inequality. So you see here something which really links us to the classics. The functional income distribution is linked to the interpersonal income distribution. And I think it is an important point to see. The next systemic inequality, of which I will spend little time, but it's an interesting one, particularly for students who want to study it because it has not been really studied much, is that the rich people tend to have higher return on their assets per dollar of assets than the people who are in the middle class. In part, and this is this complicated graph from Ed Wolf, in part it is due to the fact that rich people have most of their assets in financial assets, whereas most of the middle class and lower middle class has really housing as their asset. So if the financial assets increase faster in price than the housing, then of course, again, the rich people have higher return per unit of their assets. This is actually very clear in this graph. This is a new work by Eric Zwick, which shows you the rate of return on financial fixed income assets by your position in the wealth distribution. So what you see there, which is really, I think, quite interesting, is that if your position in the wealth distribution is a median 60th percentile, 70th percentile, even 80th percentile, the return per $1 of your asset would be between 0 and 2%. So there will be no significant returns. But when you come at the top, the return per unit of assets, which means with every dollar, is 8 or 6 or 7%. So in other words, the rich people, and that's really an important advantage, are able to take advantage of either better advice or more sort of high yielding assets, even adjusted for risk, because they have higher amount of these assets. So that, of course, alone would also transmit into higher interpersonal inequality. Because even if we have both wealth, and maybe your wealth is higher than mine, the rate of return that you receive would exacerbate that gap between me and you. In other words, you would actually have a further advantage which comes from the higher return on larger assets. So that, I think, is an important result. Now, let me come to something that I really care very much about, because it was the first time I sort of studied in Capitalism alone. And this is what I called Homoploutia. Obviously, whenever we come up with a new term, we have to go back to some kind of a Greek neologism. Homo meaning the same, and plutia, wealth. So the argument there is that we have an increasing percentage of people who are in the top of the income distribution, but who also receive significant amounts of capital and labor income. So they are both in the top among capital recipients, in the top decile, and they are also among the top labor income recipients, also in the top decile by labor income. And this graph shows you that the percentage of such people in the United States has gone up from 15% to 30%. Just to make it clear again, because at first time it may not be very clear, there are too many things going on. But if I take the top decile in the United States, So I have all the people there. That would be actually something like 30 million, 33 million people. I asked the following question: how many of these people there are also in the top decile by labor income and in top decile by capital income? So in other words, these are the people who are in top decile by total income, in top decile by labor income, and in top decile by capital income. And it turns out that about 1/3 of them are in that group. Now, if you go back to classical capitalism, if you were to ask that question, how many would be there? The answer would be close to zero. Why? Because people who were actually capital rich were unlikely to be labor rich. And nobody who was labor rich would be sufficiently rich in wealth to be the capital rich. So this is clearly a new phenomenon, that we have people who are both capital and labor rich, and of course, overall rich. And when we look at exactly the same statistic across the countries, we find, of course, as you can see here, countries that like Italy, Netherlands, Finland, US, with more than 25% of their top decile being capital and labor rich. But at the bottom, we find Mexico and Brazil with only 8%. Again, that makes sense in the sense that Brazil and Mexico are still closer to classical capitalism form, where you are not going to have rich capitalists doubling as wage workers. So the percentage of homoploutia would be much lower in those cases. Now, homoploutia is an important, I think, development. First, because we can ask how much of US inequality is due to homoploutia, of the inequality increase. What are the drivers of homoploutia? And that's something that I don't know, but I can only speculate because I have not seen them. We don't have the longitudinal data for that. There are two possibilities. One possibility is that people inherit substantial amount of wealth, and then they actually also acquire skills for education, and then really they actually have both high education and high wage and high wealth. Or differently, people can get very highly paid jobs, and then over their life cycle, they save quite a lot of money and become also rich capitalists. It's interesting which one of these two is the dominant. As I said, I don't know because I have not worked on that, and it's actually a new topic. Then homoploutia can also help us classify and understand various capitalisms. And I will not go over that today because of lack of time, but you can also already see the idea. There are capitalisms like here at the bottom, like Mexico and Brazil, which are sort of more classical in the sense that you don't have this overlap between high labor and high capital incomes. And there are capitalisms where actually you have more and more there that overlap. Final, very important question. Does homoploutia make social mobility less and fight against inequality more difficult? As I mentioned, homoploutia in some sense is good because you don't have that sharp class distinction. But on the other hand, the problem with homoploutia is that it actually creates an upper class that is very resilient to change. Because if I am rich both in terms of my wealth and my skills, I am really resilient. If the stock market goes down, I have very high level of skills and have very high income from labor. If unemployment goes up, I can fall back on my wealth. And then on top of that, we see that, people at the top trying to convey these advantages, double advantage of wealth and education to their offspring and to control the political process. So this is why, and actually this is where I want to finish because I'm, I think, running out of time. This is where, these are similar studies for homoploutia for the United States. But what I want to finish is to indicate that homoploutia is combined also with assortative mating, which is the fact that actually more and more people are marrying or partnering with people who are similar in terms of education and income as they themselves. And then they are conveying and transmitting these advantages to their children. And they do that through two tools. One tool, which has been studied by political scientists, is to make the political process reflect the needs or the desires of the rich. It is in the US, it's most obvious in terms of contributions to political campaign, which is the most concentrated form that I've ever seen. It's actually, you have seen concentration of wealth, which is very high. The concentration of political contributions is about like 10 times, it's an order of magnitude more concentrated. And this, the second tool is using the education through the elite colleges and elite universities as a form of advancement for the children, and also using them as a monopoly, because by high cost of education, you make that education accessible to only very few people who actually have that amount of money, and that essentially excludes from competition everybody else, all other children from that competition. So it is the reversal of what John Rawls actually desired to have, which was the public education, which would enable to everybody the same access. If you have an extremely elitist education that is based on money, then obviously the access is not at all the same. And of course, you have seen for the US and actually for France as well, quite a lot of studies showing, of course, very high correlation between university education and income level. And then within these people who go to university, very high correlation between the top universities and the income level of the parents. So I don't need to go into that. So let me then finish my presentation here. The two other systemic inequalities are the ones that I already mentioned. The fifth one is simply the policy responsiveness to the interest of the rich, middle class, and the poor is different. The responsiveness is much greater to the interests of the rich. This is empirical work from Martin Gilens. I've seen similar work for Germany as well, which actually shows you that the type of issues faced or which are believed to be important for the rich are the ones that are generally discussed in the political sphere and where the action is being taken by the legislator. And the issues that matter to the poor are really never make it or seldom make it through the political process. And the last one is that, that I already mentioned, the last point, the number 6, is the transmission of these advantages across generations. So on a kind of a, how should I say, pessimistic note, I would have to finish by my belief that what we are witnessing in modern capitalism is really a creation of a possibly the strongest and most intelligent or clever elite in history, which is actually able through control both of wealth and educational system to or transfer these advantages to the children and also to control the political process. So what started as looking as very good in the sense that this class divide between capital owners and workers had been weakened, or maybe in some cases almost obliterated, I think really turns out to be simply a creation of a new elite, which will be very difficult to displace, and which I think is getting very entrenched and very self-confident, because that's the elite that is actually also a hard-working elite, unlike the elites in the 19th century, which were really much more oriented, many of them actually, not all, but many of them towards leisure and light work. So I'll stop there with this more sociological observation. And of course, there will be so many, I think, topics. First, for my discussant, and also maybe from the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. And Hasan Hocam, shall we proceed with you?
Yes, let me share.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. This is a book that I read as soon as I get my hands on, and I was eagerly looking forward it before because I already read the Global Inequality by Dr. Branko Milanovic. So I'm very honored to be a discussant, and thank you very much, Özyeğin University Department of International Relations for inviting me. Okay. So I was not disappointed by the book at all. It is a great book, in my opinion. And one thing I want to really I want to make is that it's actually, despite its name, Capitalism, which is, except for a small group of people, very off-putting, it's a very easily read book. Okay, Professor Milanovic has a very good, attractive writing style. And what he does is, and he does it again and again in chapters. And for example, when he discussed the liberal meritocratic society, he points out things like homogamy or homoploutia. And you say, he starts from this micro level observations. And once it is pointed out, you say, okay, I know it. Okay, I went through the university. I know that, that's how people find each other there. They marry, and this is like, you are already convinced. And then he goes on and he builds up a meta-narrative, a macro-narrative on it. So it's actually, you don't need to be a professional academic to follow through his arguments, because the main arguments are very intuitive. And this is not only my observation, but other people I discussed the book with, they also pointed out that it's one of the few econ books that they were able to finish. I'm speaking about my small circle of non-economist friends. Okay, another thing not mentioned in today's talk, but was actually, and I want to just touch upon, is this historical role of communism. I want to start here because it's like literally eye-opening for me. It's, first of all, let's start with again another micro observation. The most dedicated, most selfless people in the early 20th century, they generally, in the what we call now the developing world, but in the colonized places or backward, whatever you call them, they joined the communist parties. Okay, and why they did that is to it was mainly because they wanted to overthrow the colonial powers and national independence. And the most principled groups were the communists. So it actually attracted the most selfless people, and many times the most educated. As we all know, there aren't really much of a working class to speak of in these countries. And and these movements are generally actually successful in overthrowing the colonizers. So a very interesting question that comes up, what about Turkey? Okay, we are from here, so what about Turkey? In my opinion, Turkey fits the rule as an exception because there was already a non-communist or socialist, a very strong modernizing movement that actually won the independence war, and then embark on a modernization attempt. Moreover, they also were from the Balkans. They had the experience, or coming from the Balkan provinces of Ottoman Empire, and they actually reduced the agricultural taxes, if not an outright land reform, but they distributed land, some leftover land from the Greeks and Armenians. And as a result, the feudalism was more or less the relations early on abolished, and the modernization movement actually get going. So I'm talking about the Kemalist revolution in 1920s and 30s. So actually, I think Turkey fits the story as an exception is of the political capitalism story. So it's not the communist parties that laid the groundwork for a rapid capitalist economic growth in the subsequent periods by accident, but actually non-communist modernizers. So there wasn't any socialist parties as modernizers. And this is important to understand is why these parties has in Turkey relatively little attractiveness for would-be modernizers. There's a strong competition, and furthermore, exception within the exception. It's hard to not to notice that the most popular, the most significant socialist movement in Turkey, they call themselves initially Maoist, now something else, happened in the southeast of Turkey, and it actually happened in the most feudal and also the most backward place. So I think this Turkey case is an exception that actually supports the Milanovic's argument about the role of the historical role of communism in 20th century. So that's my personal. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some controversial views of Professor Milanovic in the book. These are controversials in English-speaking left, okay? I don't know what to call it. For the lack of a better term, let's call it the Guardian left, the British newspaper after that. So book takes it very seriously, the anti-immigration stances, and seriously considers the anti-immigration counter-arguments coming out from let's say, the continental Europe. So the English-speaking left is very pro-immigration, but that's not really true for in the rest of the world. There are, let's say, immigration skeptic views among the left in the rest of the world. So what are the arguments advanced in the book for counter-arguments for being anti-immigration? As far as I recollect, first of all, there is the issue of who migrates to where. And if you are this is related to the talk about the high-skilled people and the high wealth correlation, especially in places like US. Well, if you're a very highly skilled programmer, you may want to go to US and skip Germany. For the simple reasons that if you strike it rich, you really get rich, even billionaires in the case of the Google founders. And so really the more generous the welfare state, the more the higher incomes are taxed. It is a less attractive place for more ambitious migrants. And the counter is also true. It's ceteris paribus. It's more attractive for less able immigrants, less educated, less likely to establish highly productive firms. The second issue is to take the anti-immigration counter-arguments in the West is that immigrants' life cycles, at least the first and the second generation, do not really goes in parallel with the mainstream of the host country, such as may not their fertility, higher fertility, they use more child benefits, and then they're lower employment. And it's even can feed into a vicious circle of slow integration to the mainstream of the host country. As a result, actually, Professor Milanovic takes this Asian-style temporary migrants with limited rights, not full citizenship rights. So no prospect of full citizenship, very seriously. The Dubai model, or you can, actually it's Singapore or Japan is not very different. So he actually takes this very, and the reason is there is no end in sight for international migration in the age of globalization. The income differences between India and West, or Africa and the West, is just huge. And the migrants will try to migrate for economic reasons. And my own research suggests that immigrants, even the, let's say, the least ambitious or least able kind, actually can do contribute to the host country despite all the negative starting point, but I will pass that at the moment. And then also Professor Milanovic has an ongoing feud with the degrowthers. Okay, I don't know if you know who are the degrowthers. These are ecologists, mostly some economists, who are sees the only solution, realistic solution to climate change is to reversing economic growth. And counter arguments by Professor Milanovic is a political dead on arrival. That's like not going to happen. In the time frame we have to act. There is no appetite for lower incomes in the Western countries, so there is no prospect for degrowth there. The degrowth goals are, their arithmetic is wrong, I agree. And that's the mainstream of the society, even in the Western, the place that is supposedly degrowth is moving on the opposite dimension, in the sense that more people are monetizing willingly, eagerly, their previously non-commercialized parts of their lives. Okay, we are selling our leisure on Instagram. We are advertising ourselves. If not everybody, we are open to renting rooms in our houses or working as cars. So I want to finish on actually offering some possible reconciliation with the environmentalists, if not the degrowthers, between the Professor Milanovic's perspective and environmentalists, using his concept of people's capitalism. I see the longer version of his presentation. He calls everybody in the future capital is plentiful, the labor is relatively scarce, the opposite of what we used in capitalism. So in such a world, why not establish or work towards an economic model where we use this people's capitalism towards green investment. I hope Professor Milanovic expand on this issue. I took the hint from the my last point from his presentation. And thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I didn't talk too much. Yes. Okay, that's all I want to share.
It was very excellent. Thank you very much. So, Professor Milanovic, would you like to respond?
Yes, first I would like really to thank Professor Tekgüç for really excellent points. Many of them I really have nothing to add because they have been really, really excellently presented. So there is nothing to say. Let me just simply maybe to stimulate the conversation, start from the very last point, which is with the degrowth or degrowers. I have very short section in the chapter 5 about that. I get sometimes criticized for like neglecting climate change. To be very clear, I'm really believe that the combination of technological developments and the subsidies and taxation and such policies would really be necessary to stop, actually, at least to reverse some of the climate-related issues and CO2 emissions and so forth. But where I disagree with the growers, as Professor Tekgüç has really well explained, is that I am, to some extent, appalled by their indifference towards reduction of poverty in the less developed world. They do seem to live only in rich countries, and they simply do not look at the fact that if you want to actually stop the current GDP at the level that it is now, you have then to condemn to poverty like 20% of the world population, if not more. Or if you really don't want to do that, and of course they never say that they want to do that, then you have to have a political action which would reduce, and actually this is purely arithmetic, that would reduce real incomes in rich countries by 50 to 60%, and actually at the top even by more. And I mean, anybody who has read anything in the newspapers knows that that particular policy, which would reduce incomes by half, is like, as Professor Tekgüç said, is dead on arrival. So they really have, I think, in my opinion, a dishonest approach. They don't want to say, well, we are maintaining people in the less developed countries poor, because that's not obviously politically correct, nor do they really want to do that. But nor do they want to say, we want to have a political movement that would really reduce incomes in rich countries substantially. And you could do that. As I was saying, actually, I wrote a piece that said, yes, it is doable. You can have actually return to rationing system. You know, that has been done in many countries in wars, in some countries even outside of wars. If you really wanted to reduce the production, consumption of meat, electricity, a number of days of work, so that actually there is less generation of CO2 emissions, you can do that. So anyway, so that's about that topic. I will skip immigration for a minute because it's yet a very big topic. And I would like only to say something about the first point, which is very interesting. And I think we could actually keep on discussing it for a long time. And this is the role of left-wing / communist parties in the transformation of colonized or semi-colonized societies in the early part of the 20th century. I explained a little bit that with respect to China, and really most of my arguments are there with respect to China. But it can also apply to some extent, as Professor Tekgüç said, to Turkey. I have actually had this point raised before. Modernization was not only a left-wing project, although the left was the most, I think, influential for the reasons that Professor Tekgüç mentioned, in the sense that you had very dedicated cadres, you had centralized organization, you had an ideology of modernization, and you had an international association that actually was supporting you. And I think that the major turning point was in the 1920s, when the anti-colonialist or anti-imperialist struggle became integral part of the left wing, because it was not always clear, because when anti-imperialist struggle became part of the left, many in that struggle were really, they were not workers. They were actually, as Professor Tekgüç said, the working class was very small in those countries. So you had to collaborate with the so-called bourgeois parties. But I do believe that the left, socialist or left or non-communist or communist left, had an important role even in countries like India, for example, because it pushed India in the direction of national liberation, in the direction of, we know later, of planning, of 5-year plans, of rural reforms, it all really came from the left. I would not be surprised that without that major change in the 1920s, India might not have gone into some kind of, Indian bourgeoisie might have gone into some kind of collaboration with the British bourgeoisie, and we might not have had India, for example, part of Commonwealth. It's not impossible, but I think the left made it much more difficult. And I think it's interesting then to look at the relationship between Kemalism and whether Kemalism actually in many respects was very similar, although Turkey, of course, is different because it was not a country that was colonized. It was an independent country despite the issues that, of course, after the World War I, Turkey had. So it does not fit totally into that mold, but I think it's interesting to investigate this part. Just last point, I wanted really, the whole thing was really motivated from my side by an attempt to figure out, well, to study what was the global historical role of communism in the 20th century, because we really don't have an idea of that. We have a liberal narrative which sees that as a sort of a cul-de-sac. It says like, communism happened, that was a mistake, and then in 1989, that mistake was corrected, and we have actually these countries going back to where they should have been to start with. But it does not explain the cases of China, which is a big one, and also Vietnam and a number of other cases that I mentioned, which all had violent anti-colonial revolutions, and the movements which led them were left-wing movements whose objective was national independence and end of feudalism. So that's actually, I think, quite interesting. So I will stop there, and that would give us actually more time for Q&A.
Yes, we have a number of questions here in the chat box. I'm going to read them unless, Şebnem, I'm going to start with yours. Would you like to ask your question yourself, or shall I read it?
No, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so she thanks you, Şebnem Hoca thanks you for this fascinating talk. She says her question concerns political preferences of the new elite. Does the fact that the new elite are both capitalists and laborers complicate their political choices and allow them to support progressive policies in a way classical capitalists wouldn't?
That's a very good question. It's really good question. I don't know. I just thought that the other way, that actually being capitalists and workers makes it more difficult from an ethical point to go, how should I say, to go with strong taxation policies, because they're actually very hard-working laborers. In a new book by Daniel Markovits, he shows that the percentage of very rich people who are working 60 to 70 hours per week is much greater than the percentage of the middle-class people who do that. So I was actually taking it from the other perspective, that is actually their power is enhanced because they are both capitalist and labor. But the question is very good. One could actually argue maybe that would make their political preferences slightly different, in the sense that they may be more willing to have, for example, higher taxation of capital. That's an interesting question. I don't know, although on the other hand, having high percentage of their income from capital still probably would not make them very keen to tax it. But it's a good question.
Right. So the other question from Can Selçuk. Thank you for the presentation. It seems to me, particularly coming from Turkey, that the declining opportunities of vertical mobility through education, combined with the pressures coming from a low-skilled workforce, Homoploutia will only help exacerbate the losses of the lower percentiles. So the phenomenon would work rather counterproductively in this part of the world. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I think actually what is very important, in my opinion, and that's something that, I hope there will be more studies for individual countries, including obviously Turkey, is the connection between the three things, I believe here, is homoploutia, an ability to actually have significant incomes from capital and labor, homogamy, the marriage of similars, which again is something which is very good because it really linked to the greater labor participation of women. However, in simply arithmetic terms, it actually does exacerbate inequality. And the ability of such couples then to have very high investment in children and to try to control the political process so that reproduction of the elites continues. And I see that same pattern actually from work that I did with a Chinese co-author and another co-author. We see it also in China. You know, China, of course, historically has had huge investments in education. Education is very elitist. It has become even more elitist now than in the past. And there is a similar attempt exactly to combine the economic power with political power. So we might have an ironic convergence of the two capitalisms through the essentially combination of political economic power in both cases.
Yes, the next question is a little bit long from Salvatore. I wonder if the labor capital that is directed to fixed income asset ownership's excessive growth and eventually feed homoploutia is the outcome of the financialization, in parentheses, the excessive growth of overall hedge funds, capital markets, etc., which assume to be roughly 1.5 quadrillion US dollars. Can we assume that post-2008 QE and bailout programs, which directed liquidity to the financial giants one way or another, feed the significant growth of post-2008 homoploutia? In short, how much we should blame the financial and monetary markets and those rentier income abusers for the income inequality?
It's a difficult question. I really don't know. If you look at, I didn't look at that specifically. If you look at that slide that was there, homoploutia has been on the increase since the early 1980s. And I don't know if there was I actually don't even remember exactly in the slide where there was an increase after 2008. There could be, but unfortunately, I don't know. It is very specific question, which has to do with really QE and the effects of the QE after the crisis. You know, something similar, but you know, who knows how it would be with all the with what's happening now with COVID and really very significant programs, which in the US, but also in Europe, or in the US, they are actually more than 20% of GDP. We have never seen anything like that in the past. So I think it is difficult to, at least now, it is difficult to see their effects. It's too early, I would say.
Yes, so this question is from Burak Gürel. Professor Milanovic, thank you so much for this insightful talk. I would like to ask a question about a specific dimension of economic development in the previously non-capitalist countries of Eurasia. How do you see the contribution of rural collectivization to the long-term economic trajectories of China and Russia?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me go with China first. As you know, the rural collectivization and communes, which started in 1950, have then continued more or less, I mean, with some changes during the Cultural Revolution, but they continued until 1978 when the responsibility system kicked in. And the responsibility system was a system whereby individual households were responsible for the delivery of agricultural products to the government, but everything which was beyond that delivery quota, beyond that responsibility, was their own, and that could be sold on the market. So that was the creation of this double track, like two markets, one, the official market with lower prices, another one, a free market with higher prices. And that system was very similar to what in the Soviet Union in the 1920s was as a new economic policy. So that was, of course, what happened in China. That continued, as you know, of course, China still the land, which I think is not really much of a difference, but the land is still rented. So you have long-term leases on land, not direct private property. But as we all know, the longer the lease, the less difference does it make. Actually, in many countries, including the United States, you actually have leases which go for 99 years. And that's the same as property for all intents and purposes. Now, in the Soviet Union, collectivization was extremely violent, as we know, and the objective was, unfortunately, like in many developments of modernization, was really squeezing out the surplus from labor, and in this case, from peasantry. That was, eventually, of course, it led to the industrialization of the Soviet Union, because without that surplus and with autarkic environment that the Soviet Union was in, it's very difficult how the industry would have been created. But the costs of that in terms of human lives are, of course, very high.
Yes, another question from Duygun Ruban. Do you disagree with the analysis that capitalism as a system based on economic growth is the driver of climate change? Given your opposition to the degrowth agenda, what do you suggest is to be ultimately done to reverse climate change?
I don't see capitalism as such as being a driver. Yes, it is true. Capitalism as the only system is by definition the driver of the climate issues. But it is really economic growth, modernization, increase in income, reduction in poverty that are drivers, because we want to have higher incomes. We want to have all the good things that come with higher incomes. We want to reduce poverty. And in order for all these things to happen, we have to have more goods and services. And as we have more goods and services, they are the ones responsible for climate change. So to say capitalism is responsible for climate change, it's in some sense true, and in some sense does not very much illuminate the issue. The real issue is growth. And in my opinion, growth is good. So what do we do then? I mean, this is a conundrum. We have something which is good, which is growth, but that something which is good produces an effect which potentially can be extremely ruinous for the world. And as I said before, and I want to repeat on that, it is not really an area that I can give you easy answers, nor do know them sufficiently, because it's a very complex area when you look at that, when you take physics and all these other issues into consideration. But I believe that with the policies that would stimulate certain activities that are good in terms of emissions, or actually low carbon emission, and punish for taxation activities that are not, we would be able actually to slow down the process. So that's what I believe. In that sense, I'm really, as I said before, economic optimist or technological optimist. I don't think that it's impossible. The question is whether we are willing to do that. And if you ask people, they're just last point in the US, they're very willing to replace, plastic bags with paper bags. But if you tell them, okay, let's go for the price of gasoline from $3, whatever it is now, to $10, well, they don't like it very much.
Yes, I don't have other questions in the chat box. Would anyone else on the floor pose a question? I can ask one question, Professor Milanovic, and it is in your book. It's about your provocative proposal concerning migration to make it politically acceptable. you propose certain type of, as Hasan Hoca talked about, a migration pattern. I was just wondering and thinking in terms of territorial inequalities within a country. For those countries that are not geographically big, my question wouldn't apply, but for relatively big countries like Turkey, do you think a proposal on similar terms would work to address regional disparities?
No, I believe, I mean, I try to, in that section, and I'm glad that actually it was brought out by Professor Tekgüç, I try to be very clear as clear as possible. I would say in the way it was written, it's almost Ricardian in the sense that it's actually, it is very abstract, but it follows, I think, logically. I start with the assumption, which I think comes from economics, that movement of access to production, including labor, is a good thing. So if we have a movement of capital, there is no reason why we should not have worldwide movement of labor. It would reduce inequalities. It would increase output. We know that there are actually studies for that. And not only do we know that, we can prove it by reductio ad absurdum, because if movement from Mali to France is not good, then there should be no good also movement within France. Then there should be no good movement also within Paris. So it's really ad absurdum that you can actually argue that there cannot be overall, in terms of overall output, negative effects. And as I said, if people were really like avatars and then you just move them like in a game from A to B, that it has to be an improvement for all the reasons that we know. People work with more capital, they produce a higher output and all that. The problems, however, appear, and actually I take a very strong disagreement with some people on the right who actually speak of free movement of capital, but they are very much against free movement of labor. I say it is inconsistent for all the reasons that I just mentioned. But why I modify this position is because I take, as Professor Hasan said, actually I take seriously the arguments, not because I think that the arguments of people who are actually against migration are correct economically, but they do have a political power. If they have a political power, then the danger, in my opinion, is that they would push the situation to such an extreme that Europe, for example, could become really sort of a closed continent, so fortress Europe. And that would be, in my opinion, the worst possible outcome. So then, in order to kind of have this political issue resolved or diminished, I bring up this sort of a trade-off whereby I say, okay, are you going to accept one more migrant if that one more migrant does not have path to citizenship and does not stay in your country forever, but has a temporary visa of 5 years, which actually exists already in quite a few countries. You have that. So that was my argument, that there is a trade-off, that there is a greater willingness to accept migration if it comes with fewer rights. And so that was a way to solve this conundrum. And I'm aware of all the drawbacks of that it can actually bring sort of an underclass. It is actually discrimination. The discrimination would not come at work, because I think at work the rules have to be exactly the same. Discrimination would come from the obligation to return back to one's country of origin after 5 years. So that's where the difference is, and lack of civic rights, like, for example, right to vote, obviously participation in local elections and so on. So that would not be there. So it is, as Professor Tekgüç said, it is really very much the Asian model. It is the model of the Gulf Council countries. It's the model of Singapore. It's also a model of Japan. It's not an ideal model. It has all these drawbacks that I don't like, but I'm afraid that if we don't go with some compromise like that, that we might end up with really like zero migration. And the Guardian model, yes, that's nice in sort of a theory, but we have seen that actually in practice, Brexit was driven a lot by dislike of migration. And that was, then we can just go in The Guardian and write as much as we want, how we would love to have open borders, but the outcome politically may be the very opposite.
Yes. So yeah, okay. Anybody else? Any questions? So I guess I'm not missing anything in the chat box, am I? I've read all the questions, I believe. Would you like to add? So I think we'll have to end here. Professor Milanovic and Professor Tekgüç, for the last time, would you like to add anything to what you already said?
Not me, but maybe Professor Tekgüç would like.
No, I already talked. So if somebody else wants to add, I'm not going to use the floor time. Thank you very much again.
Thank you both very much for accepting our invitation. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you both. And thank you to the audience for joining us. And hopefully we'll see each other again another time. And we would very much like to invite you, Professor Milanovic, to Istanbul to host you when things go back to near normal. So thank you to everyone and hope to see you next time.
We'll be very happy to come. Thank you again for listening, for participating, and hope to see you then, as you said, in person, actually, hopefully, when this is all over in Istanbul.
Hopefully. Exactly.
Hopefully. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.